Once you finish living life, what did trying to sell the movie teach you about the business?
Yeah, so I had finished the film, and I didn't know anyone in Hollywood or LA or anything like that. I was living in Seattle, where I grew up, and I had just barely been able to kind of put the finishing touches on the film, but we still didn't really have a mixed film. There were still components missing because I didn't have all the money to kind of finish it fully. And so I had this kind of friend in Seattle who was kind of helping produce, who I'd met, and he said he had seen this article in like Variety or Hollywood Reporter, and it was basically an advertisement from a film distributor saying like, "Hey, we're looking for indie films to help finish and release." If you could even believe this,
Oh,
like in the
wow.
classified section or something in the back of the physical magazine, you know. And he told me that he said he sent a DVD copy down to this address, and I was like, "You're crazy! There's no way! Like this is either a scam or like this is not real. That's not how films get distributed." But then this is a totally true story. But then, literally on the day I was graduating from high school, I got a call from his number in LA, and they're like, uh, "We saw your film. Someone sent us this DVD, and we want to like pick up the film and distribute it and pay to finish it." And I was just like,
Wow.
"This can't be real." Um, but it was, and so that's what happened. And
How
I
cool.
mean, this would never happen nowadays. And this distributor wasn't. I don't want to say it wasn't legit, but it is. It doesn't exist anymore. It did a few films for a few years and then went away. But for me, it was perfect. They literally paid to finish the film. They released it in theaters in a few cities, and they put it out there. I think they were just looking for films, and this worked for them. And they did like the idea that this young kid had made this movie and the kind of story they could build around that, which they did. Um, so, I mean, everything is obviously completely changed now, because nowadays I could have just put the film online and probably reached just as many people or whatever myself. But back then, you couldn't even put a feature film on the internet back when I made this movie, 2003, 2004. So, yeah, it's a pretty crazy story and experience, but definitely something I won't ever forget.
And sorry, they called on a cell phone? Like, were you at
No,
the
no, I don't think I
graduation?
even
Oh,
had a
okay.
cell phone. Like, I think they called. I think they called my house. Basically, my parents answered, or something. And I was about to go to my graduation, though, my high school graduation. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
So I get when you went to accept that degree, I'm sure you had a huge smile on your face. You're
for
like,
sure.
wow,
No,
this is
I mean
pretty cool.
it was crazy. And then a few weeks later, I literally packed up and moved to LA because they wanted me to come down to help kind of do some re-editing on the film and finishing it up. And so that's what I did as like an 18-year-old kid, just having graduated. I drove down to LA by myself and spent the next year basically. First, we kind of did some changes to the film. Then they did the final mixing and the color correction. And then they transferred it to film, because back then, again, you couldn't even play a movie in the theater without it being on 35 millimeter film. And so they transferred this movie we'd shot onto film. And and then it got into a couple festivals and had a few opportunities like that. But it was just a whirlwind, and it definitely gave me this little window into kind of how it works to distribute a film. Making the poster, doing the promotion, doing some press, and this was all as like a 19, 18-year-old kid who had just made this random little film, thinking nothing would happen from it. That it was just my experience of film school. But it became that. It became even more continuation of that side of things. So uh, I don't think something like this would ever happen nowadays. And the film, I mean, you can find the film. I think it's on like Amazon maybe right now or something. Like it's not a film I would recommend you watch. But I think at the time it fit. It fit the need of what they were looking for and worked. But more than anything, it just was an amazing life experience and an incredible story.
And that's what got you down to Los Angeles was
Yeah,
this film?
yeah, exactly. So I moved there for that, and then I spent the next few years, after the film had come out, I started writing something else, but then I just kind of started, living there, making friends, and just kind of, I guess, living my own life a little bit more. And then what started happening is I started getting emails from other young filmmakers who had kind of heard about my film now that there had been some press. Maybe they'd seen it in whatever city it had played in. And they started reaching out to me, asking if I could watch their film or if I could help them out. And I started realizing, this was like 2005, probably when the film came out. this was even before, I think Facebook hadn't even existed yet. This was MySpace era maybe, but like it was very hard to kind of connect with other people around the world, let alone probably even in your own city that had the same interests or passions unless you physically had met them, right? And so I really didn't have a lot of other connections to young filmmakers. I didn't know how many were out there. And at the time, there was no film festival for young directors. There was, really no way to kind of meet other young filmmakers. So I started getting all these emails from young filmmakers, and it made me realize that, there really should be something like this for young filmmakers to kind of showcase their films, maybe a film festival for young directors. And but that didn't exist. So I guess as I was kind of living in LA, had just made this film a few years earlier, didn't really have anything else going on. I thought, okay, maybe I should just do a little side project and try this for a little mini festival and see what happens. And so that's what I ended up deciding to do. I actually moved back to Seattle just because I knew it would be easier to start something like that in a town I was from and knew all the people and everything. And so I moved back to Seattle, and I thought I'd just do this for a year, and I'd come back to LA and go back to working on my own, pursuing my own career. And what happened was we got hundreds of submissions from all over the world, from all these young directors. I'm talking like at the time it was 21 and younger was the age, and it was mind blowing because up until that point I'd been kind of so isolated and didn't think there was that many other young filmmakers trying to do this just like me out there. And it was the opposite. There were so many. And so I kind of realized like, okay, this could become a huge thing. This could be a really wonderful thing if I wanted to do this. But I don't think I could do this while also trying to pursue my own career still. And so I basically had to make a decision, what I should do. And I decided that, this was just too important of a thing, I think, to exist. And it had so much, you could just feel the momentum, I guess, that was behind it. And so I decided to basically take a pause in my own film career pursuing, and I decided to kind of start and run this film festival for young directors. And that's what I did for the next basically 7-8 years after that.
So how long, you'd been in LA, you said about a year when you started getting these emails?
Yeah, I think a year or two, yeah.
Sorry, where were you staying? If you don't, just the town that you were staying
in LA?
Yeah.
I was living in like Santa Monica at the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you packed up your apartment or wherever you were and then headed back, I don't know, up the 5 or however, whatever route, was this a feeling of defeat or a feeling of excitement driving back home?
I think it was a little bit of both, but it didn't feel, I guess because I knew I was going there to go and do this film festival, I was excited because I had this project that I knew I wanted to go start, and that was already I was already getting submissions in. I think I'd already kind of started the pre-planning from LA, so I knew I'd picked a date. Like it was already a thing that was going to happen, basically. And so I was working on it, but I think there was an element of like, should I be doing this? This isn't going to help me personally. Like I should be focusing on my own career, but I think just it just felt like the kind of the right thing to do, and just felt super exciting. And but again, I was thinking I would do this for a year. The festival probably wouldn't be that big, and then I would come back, and be back soon. So I think I even had kept some stuff in storage down there, thinking I was going to come back. And so it was. It wasn't the typical like, okay, I failed and I'm going back, but it was more like, I guess here's the next adventure. And I was still only 20, 21 years old probably at the time, so it was still so young, honestly, for everything I was doing at the time.
Right. Wow, that's really cool. So you get back home and then you end up staying 7-8 years?
Yeah, I think I stayed probably about 7 or 8 years. So when I first moved back, I moved back in with my parents basically, because I knew I wasn't going to make any money running this film festival, at least at first. And so for the first year, I basically did everything. I watched all the films myself, programmed the whole festival. I had to raise money to put the festival together, so I started going to like corporate sponsors. I would just hit them up on like LinkedIn or something and just pitch them, be like, hey, I'm starting this film festival. It's all young directors, and the audience that's going to come is going to all be pretty young people, which is kind of, those people aren't coming to movies right now, And so I don't know. I guess I put together this good little pitch, and I started getting actual sponsors to help us pay for this festival. And it was basically just like making a movie. And so I think all the skills that I'd learned while making this feature a few years earlier, I was able to now use to put together this film festival, because it was the same thing. You have to raise the money, you have to put the people together, you have to like do all the actually planning and execution for this big event or whatever, the big shoot or whatever you want to have it be. And, that's what I did. So I just threw everything at it and, worked nonstop, basically put all of my energy and life into it. And it was a huge hit. The festival was packed the first year, and it was just like this. It was so obvious that this could be something so big and was going to be something so important. I mean, I bet probably what they felt like in the early days of like a Sundance or something like that. I mean, this is what it felt like, because there wasn't anything like that for this audience of filmmakers. There was nothing, and there was no category at any of the big festivals for youth films or anything like there is even now. There was nothing. And so I think what no one realized, including myself, was just that around the world there was thousands of these young filmmakers, but just didn't have a place to show their films, and this was giving them that opportunity. And so from there it just exploded, and every year we got more and more submissions. We started getting thousands of submissions, and the festival grew to more days, and soon, I think by 4 years into it, there was 12,000 people coming to see these films every weekend in Seattle. Short films basically by young directors, and it was an incredible thing. I got to meet filmmakers from all over the world. They would come out just like any other festival. They would fly out to Seattle for the festival, and I think what was so special was they all got to meet each other. So the same experience I had, whereas like I don't know any other young filmmakers really. They all had that same experience, but they got to actually meet each other at the festival and kind of share stories. And we started doing panels and workshops and all that kind of stuff. And so, nowadays that probably exists so much more online. And so I think a physical festival like that is probably even less maybe important than it was back then. But back then, this was such the early days of online and connecting, that this was so important, and really I think was the perfect timing for what needed to exist and didn't exist. And it was just, everything kind of aligned, and it was a really special thing.
Right, and I think too, DSLRs started coming out a little bit past that point, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, the technology was changing, so we could have more and more people making films. It wasn't even like 3 years earlier when I was making my feature. You could now shoot a film with a DSLR, with a cheaper camera, and have it look good, right? I don't think yet you could start filming yet quite on the iPhone at this time in the early days of the festival, but still, it was just right around the corner. It was that kind of idea that it was much easier for almost anyone to make a film, and that definitely changed everything, because we started getting films from filmmakers of all walks of life. It was no longer the rich kids from USC, no offense to them, but those kind of people that maybe originally could only make films that looked good, right? Now it was people from all over the world. I mean, every walk of life, every kind of person was able to make a film now and tell their story. And it was pretty amazing, the kind of films and the stories and the filmmakers we got to showcase over the years. And the festival still exists. It's in its 15th year now. I personally have left, and it's on its own, but it's still going strong and showing films every year.
And too, YouTube had just started coming out, and Vimeo, Dailymotion, things like that. So was that helpful in the sense that now you could actually see these trailers online?
For sure,
rather
yeah.
than sending it?
Also with the festival, we were one of the first festivals really to actually use kind of digital submissions, because we were mostly dealing with short films. We started collecting films over the internet, which I know nowadays probably sounds crazy, but even back then you had to mail in a DVD to a festival or something like that, and but we started using different platforms to basically kind of collect these films digitally, which again I think also allowed us to reach people from all over the world that maybe couldn't mail a DVD around the world or whatever to some random address in Seattle. And it was right at that era where everything was changing. I mean, this was 2007, 2008 was the first year of the festival, and that was when big crash was happening, so the economy was struggling, and so raising the money was hard. But at the same time, technology and everything was also changing so rapidly fast, and the way we were experiencing things. And so I think it was just an exciting time, even though it was a struggling time for the country. It was also just a very exciting time, I think, with just all the changes in technology and tech companies and everything kind of coming up right then. And so we kind of fit nicely, I guess, into all of that.
Wasn't just Tom from MySpace.
Exactly, yeah.
At what point did running NFFTY become overwhelming, maybe? Because so many people, it was a good problem to have, but in some ways you had to bring on new people to help?
For sure. It was pretty much overwhelming from the beginning, but by after the first year or two, I think it was beyond the point where I could just physically do everything myself, you know? I mean, again, I was getting my parents to help. My mom was a huge help in the first few years, almost a co-founder with me practically. And just, again, kind of like the movie where like, they're like, I said, I'm going to do this. And they're like, okay, sure. But, you know, kind of knew that I was going to go at it. And so they, of course, came in to help as I was struggling and just overwhelmed by trying to pull this all off. So they were a huge help. But then, yeah, I think after the first couple festivals, we finally were able to get a few sponsors, get some grants, and able to start paying a small salary to me, but also start paying enough money to hire at least people seasonally. And then from there, we were able to expand to more, a couple other year-round people, and, you know, slowly kind of grew it into an actual kind of organization that could put together this event. And then from there, we also started doing some year-round programming and some other things beyond just the physical 3-day festival or whatever. But it was like making a couple feature films in one probably every year. I mean, just the amount of work. It seems crazy to think you'd spend a whole year putting on a 4-day event, but it's just, there's so much from marketing, just even to find the filmmakers, right? To find these films, we would, again, back in the day, we would physically mail like a flyer or poster to thousands of film schools and colleges all over the country. We would search online where we could to find ones internationally, you know, and then we would have to start screening these films and processing that, and then programming them together, and then meanwhile raising all the money on the side. And then the festival had parties and events and other things like that. So it was this huge undertaking, and it was definitely overwhelming. But again, it was just like making a movie. I mean, it was the same kind of skills as producing a movie would be producing a big event like this. So it was something I was, I guess, comfortable with, but it was definitely a lot of work. And I think eventually, after probably the 5th or 6th year, I kind of realized, as amazing as this was and as incredible as it had been for me personally, that I wanted to get back to making stuff myself. And so I kind of eventually started trying to work to hiring other people to kind of take over and let me kind of transition out of the festival. And at the same time, I had started doing commercials. Basically, the sponsors that I had found to put together to fund the festival, they had been asking for like, hey, could we play our commercials, our TV commercials at the film festival as part of our sponsorship? And we did that the first year, but it was kind of awkward because you were going to this really creative, wonderful film festival with cool short films, but then you'd see like a TV commercial before it, you know, and it just didn't feel right. And so the next year, I told one of our sponsors, like, hey, why don't you let me make like a custom commercial for you for our festival and kind of speak to this young audience, you know? And it won't cost you anything. Like, we'll just do it out of the money you're going to give us anyways. Like, we'll call in some favors. Like, we're filmmakers. We know how to make a commercial, right? And we did that, and it was a huge success. It was actually for Volvo cars that we did that for the first year, who had become a pretty big sponsor of us. And we did one every year since, basically, afterwards. And other sponsors started asking for it. And so even though it wasn't what I was trying to do, it accidentally kind of created this commercial reel for myself, because I was the one also directing these commercials because it was for the festival. And so I basically kind of saw this path to where I could maybe transition out of doing the festival and go back to filmmaking via making commercials. And so that's kind of what I did. And it wasn't just like, obviously I was so lucky because I had this festival and something I could be doing, you know, while I was also pursuing the commercial. So I didn't have to just like one day switch it off and go on to the next thing, right? Cold. But I could kind of like tiptoe in and kind of go back and forth a little bit. And that's kind of what I did over maybe a course of 4 years or so, kind of transitioning, I guess, into the different area. And then that's kind of from there, I ended up really doing commercials ever since then. Almost, that's been probably 10 years now. I've been doing that as my kind of, I guess, way of living and directing full time, but doing commercials.
Were there ever incidents where the venue fell through or something happened, or again, the I don't know if you're using DCP or what you were using to play but things weren't working even though you tested them?
For sure.
Good times.
Yeah, no, there was always challenges. I mean, our very first year, we were playing off of a DVD, and I remember it had so many issues with playback because, you know, back then if you were making your own DVD, sometimes it would be a bad reader or something, and the films were skipping, and it was a whole disaster. But we kind of started doing little skits and kind of entertaining the audience, and it actually had this great energy because it was so kind of unexpected. It was almost like a screening at someone's house, you know, and even though it feels like it would be awkward, it somehow added to the charm, I guess, of the festival. And from then on, I never played off any DVDs anymore because I was so scared. So we started making basically like custom QuickTime files of the whole string of movies and playing off that. So we never had too many technical issues because we kind of learned our lesson. But it was always, the biggest challenge really more than anything was just finding the money. You know, it really was like making a movie where in order to pull it off, you had to kind of be like, okay, we're going to go on this date and it's just going to happen and we're going to make it happen, right? And it was the same with the festival where every year every year was the same weekend, but we'd basically know we had the festival, you know, the last weekend of April every year, and we didn't have any of the money really to put it together. So we'd have to then spend that whole year trying to basically raise the money to make it happen. But of course, you know, no one would want to pay out long times in advance. So it would be, you know, a few weeks out even sometimes, and I would still be trying to get the last bit of money to pull the festival together. We'd have to maybe make a deposit on a venue, but not knowing we could even pay for it. So it was just a lot of like gambling and risking, but just kind of having to know we would put it together. And it always worked out because I think with anything like this, it always does really. And obviously there's tons of luck, but I think if you just dive into something and you put all your energy into it, you can figure out a way to make it happen. You know, maybe you got to make compromises, of course, along the way, which we did. But I think there's just something about just going in on going 110% on something, and you'll figure out a way. You'll find a way.
So did you sell the festival? What was the turning point where you said, I really want to make these films and do the commercial?
Yeah, so we founded the festival as a nonprofit. So I didn't like even physically own it legally. It was, you know, I was a board member and I was the founding executive director or whatever of it, but it wasn't something I could really sell. It was more something that we had to just find someone to take over. It was almost like part of the community, I guess, you know? And so I eventually found someone else to kind of take over as the director and run it. And I stayed on the board and kind of helped for a few years to kind of hopefully see it transition. So I don't have any kind of real involvement anymore other than just being a supporter of it and going to it whenever I can. But yeah, it was more just about me kind of figuring out, okay, how could I go? I think for a few years I went from being the executive director to then I found someone else to do that, and I was just doing the artistic side, like I was just helping with picking the films, and I could take that extra time to go make commercials and do other stuff. So I think over a couple of years I just kind of did less and less of the festival while I could do more and more of the commercials, hopefully. And you know, I didn't have some sort of calculated plan. It was kind of figuring it out as I went. And, you know, it was not easy because obviously getting into commercial directing is not easy at all. I mean, one is you have to have you almost already kind of need to have the work even before they hire you. So a lot of times, even though I had shot a few commercials, I needed to maybe make some other spec things or shoot some more stuff, you know, and it was constantly just having to kind of prove that I could go and do this. And, you know, it was never easy, but, again, I think it's just something where if you go all in on it and kind of keep pursuing it, you can find a way.
So with a nonprofit, you're not having an LLC, it's a 50.
Yeah, it's a 501c3. Yeah.
Okay. And so it's similar paperwork that you're filling out for the most part? And
yeah, I mean, to actually get that 501c3 status from the government, you have to like go through some processes to get that, you know, because then people can make donations tax deductible. So there's some like elements involved because they don't want to just give it to anybody who's not actually doing something. It's supposed to be for the greater good or whatever, and actually not for profit making, you know, but for creating something. And so, yeah, it's kind of a process. But once you kind of get that going, it opens you up to be able to get grants and other kind of sources of funding, kind of to put it together. And
so then, as sort of a board member of a charity or a 501c3, a nonprofit,
yeah,
then you can turn over the reins. You're not really selling it. You're just turning over the reins.
Yeah, you're not selling it because it was never even. It was like no one's. It's hard to describe. Like a nonprofit is literally not owned by anyone. It's an entity, and you can have managers of it. But if it makes money, I don't get to just like take that money. Like it's its entity's money. Its entity is its own thing. And so a nonprofit is kind of like for the greater good, you know. And so you can still decide who takes control of it, but it's kind of belongs to no one and everyone at the same time, you know. And I guess that's kind of the good and bad of starting it that way. where I didn't actually have total control. So once I left, I couldn't really control it anymore, you know, and I struggled with that too, because of course it was like my child. I wanted to see it always succeed, you know, but then the cool part is it gave everyone that then took over that kind of ownership and that feeling that they were part of this too, you know, because it was now their baby, I guess. And so, yeah.